Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I am Scott Parkin, your co-host in Berkeley, California. And as always, I'm joined by
Bob Bazanko. I'm in Ohio today. I'll be in Texas tomorrow. So make of that what we will.
Deep in the heart, Bob.
Yeah, going back home. Actually, I never thought I'd say this. I'm going to a more progressive place heading back to Texas than Ohio. But it's always good to be here. And as always, we begin by thanking everybody who watches and telling you how much we appreciate it and asking you to tell people about this. You know, people say this is the best podcast ever. And, you know, we're nominated for all kinds of awards. I believe, you know, the Academy Awards have nominated us, and we're in talks now for a film version of Green and Red podcast starring Steve Sharippa and Alec Baldwin as me and Scott. So
right.
It's moving. So please share it. The algorithms love feedback. So if you could comment and like it and review it and subscribe, that would be really awesome too. And to keep it going, we've been going for over a year now, and we are, what is it? We are in the top 10% now of.
We are in the top 10%. That's actually that's very true.
Yeah. What, the movie thing isn't true that you told me about?
We're awaiting our potty nomination.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it come through.
But you told me you were talking to David Chase the other day, so you just made that up.
Yeah. I think it was a different David Chase when I saw the call.
Okay.
We also want to ask our loyal audience out there that if you haven't donated to the Green and Red podcast, please check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/Green Red podcast. And become a patron, a recurring donor. We have a small but mighty patron corps known as our M19 Brigade. And if you want to just make a one-time donation, go to greenandredpodcast.org, our website, which is updated on the regular, and hit the support button, and you will be able to support your favorite podcast and your favorite podcast hosts as we endeavor through this journey of internet media. So, and thanks to everyone else out there who already has donated or is a patron.
Before we talk about today's show, since everyone in the world has weighed in on the Derek Chauvin verdict, I just thought maybe we could say a couple things about it too, because, you know, we have to fit in with all the cool kids. So Scott, what do you think?
I mean, I was glad to see the verdict, and I just want to acknowledge that part of the reason that it happened was that because millions of you and millions of us were out on the street. Like everyone I know, in most of my, in any kind of political circle I'm in, went to some demonstration, went to some protest, to some even direct actions to put pressure on the police state over the murder of George Floyd. And in my mind, you know, the state does not move unless the street is pushing on it. And there was a lot of politicians across the political spectrum who were like, this is, you know, people in the street don't matter. It's how the Democrats mobilize in the election, or it's how the politicians respond, et cetera, or how the corporations respond. But the important factor that happened starting last summer, and which continues now, was all of you out in the street. And you don't have to go to a fancy school or hold a fancy office or have a fancy job or be a media talking head or even a part of the faux pundit class in the Brooklyn podcast world. All you have to do is get together with your friends and do it safely and go take action. I want to say that about Chauvin. I think that we're all part of the reason that there was actually some level of justice happen this week.
That's really critical because, you know, he wasn't even indicted for 4 or 5 days. It was, I believe, after the precinct burned down. And remember, 54% of Americans supported the burning of a police precinct in Minneapolis. But yeah, the movement was really amazing. I mean, not just in Minneapolis and New York and the Bay Area, but in Warren, Ohio, and Vidor, Texas, and Boise, Idaho, and every state, you know, 25 or so million.
Sandpoint, Idaho, according to our last interview.
Yeah. And, you know, and the important thing there, you mentioned the corporations, is that put pressure on the ruling class because it destabilized the system so badly. And if we may brag again, we have been talking about the ruling class and destabilization since this podcast began. And in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I have seen stories all over the corporate media about this. And we've been talking about it a year ago, right? But I think that's really the case. And so that's when you started to see like NASCAR and Harley Davidson and the Pentagon, you know, get into this issue, you know, and Trump really badly misplayed it. The one thing I want to say, which is really the first thing you said, was I was happy to see the verdict. And if there's anything that like kind of struck me is as soon as it came down, a lot of people, most people, like people who contacted me or I left people on social media immediately said, well, you know, it's one guy and this, you know, it doesn't mean anything. And it's still a racist police system. And they're still, you know, at the moment the verdict was rendered, a police killed a 16-year-old young Black girl in Columbus, Ohio. You had the Dante Wright killings not far from Minneapolis a few days ago. That's all true. But it's okay to enjoy it. I when Scott had the pleasure of hearing me singing Springsteen when we came on, and he has a line, you know, it ain't no sin to be glad you're alive. And it's okay to say, hey, this is a good verdict. Would it have been better if he'd been acquitted? No, the country would be blowing up right now. Would this have happened 10 years ago? Probably not. Even with video, probably not, you know? So, you know, police are starting to be held accountable to some degree. And that's because people have been in the streets and doing all this. So, you know, it's okay to say, hey, we got this one. That's good. And little victories, you build on them. You know, it's not going to occur like overnight. You're not going to have some kind of revolutionary upheaval. So, you know, it's good. It's good news. And I'm not going to qualify it. I'm not going to, you know, condition it. Like, it's really good that it happened this way, you know, and it scares police, which is good. Everyone's like, oh, the police are scared. And like, good, you know, let them fear that they could be the next ones, you know.
There's a great two parts I want to throw in on this is in 1980 in Miami, there was a Black motorcyclist who basically led police on a high-speed chase. When the police finally caught him, they beat him to death. And 4 police officers, Miami police officers, were put on trial. And the homicide division and the press thought it was a slam dunk of a murder conviction for at least one of the 4. And they were acquitted of all charges. Led to the Liberty City riots in 1980 in Miami, where you know, socioeconomic conditions, racism, etc., had, you know, made it a ticking time bomb anyway. But that acquittal led to a huge explosion of race riots. And 41 years later, because of video, because of a powerful movement, we have been able to begin to shift things like that. Racism is not necessarily getting worse because we're seeing a lot. It's just being recorded, like Will Smith actually recently said. Yeah. And I want to say that the work that we all do is what's really important. And I am not opposed to riots. I'm not opposed to people being on the street and doing whatever they need to do. But you know, these changes only happen because we're out agitating.
I think, and this is the last thing I'll say, I think the one thing that scares the police the most is that we're not scared anymore. You know, like you saw that last summer with just this multi-generational, multi-class, multiracial group of people, the Wall of Moms, as well as obviously Black Lives Matter leading it, and Antifa, and throwing down, you know, and we are not cupcakes like the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers who are running around snitching on each other and crying and doing all that kind of stuff. So anyway, I think it was good news. And Chauvin is not an aberration. He's not an outlier. Absolutely true. This problem persists. It's going on. The police will probably shoot somebody and kill him today. It's inevitable. You know, it's like, what is it, 1,500 a year. So it's not going away, but you know, we have some juice. So today's show is going to be one of our kind of a history show, and it's something we have talked about a long time. And on my blog, afflicttthecomfortable.org, which is part of the Green and Red media empire, I wrote a piece in November, just, I don't know, on the spur of the moment, about Jimmy Carter. And I think it was called, I'll say it right here, Jimmy Carter is a liberal saint now, was a war criminal then. And I do not get the traffic of Jacobin or any of those big New York publications, obviously. But for some reason, this thing is like really taken off. And I'm still getting, like, every week, I'm still getting like hundreds of reads. I have no idea why. And we've talked about doing a show about this for some time, about Jimmy Carter. And so the recent death of his vice president, Walter Mondale, kind of became the impetus to actually do it. And the reason I think Carter is important, one, because I think it's just historically, it's always important to understand what people really were like and what they really did. But we're going to say a lot of negative stuff about Jimmy Carter, right? Jimmy Carter is lionized, and he should be. I don't want you to think, you know, I mean, his work with Habitat for Humanity, the Carter Center working on elections all over the world, his views on race, his outspoken views on race. He won a Nobel Prize for working on the North Korea nuclear agreement in the 90s. On Israel, he's remarkable. He has used the word apartheid in a book title to describe Israel's treatment of Palestinians. So he's a great guy. And I think that's the point, because people like that don't become president if they're people like that, right? Most of the time, all the time, to get to that level of power in the government, whether it be president, Senate, courts, whatever, you fit into this super framework of what the oligarchy wants. And only rarely does somebody move beyond that. And we're seeing that now, right? All these people like Boehner, John Boehner, oh, I hate Trump, and I voted for him, right? And you're seeing people who are criticizing Trump and not really distancing themselves. That's why, like, Liz Cheney has become Trump's biggest critic in this upside down world we have. But rarely does a member who was at that level, and I can think of a few, one, and we'll talk about him in a future show, is Ramsey Clark, who was the Attorney General. Ramsey Clark's father was Tom Clark, who was a Supreme Court justice, who, if he didn't write the decision, certainly voted for the putting Japanese in concentration camps in World War II. Ramsey Clark was Attorney General and later became a huge advocate for non-intervention, anti-imperialism, and civil rights. Before Carter, the best known, I would say, would probably be George Kennan, who was one of the architects of the Cold War, famous diplomat, who later in life became like this ardent critic of nuclear weapons, nuclear proliferation. And in the 1980s, wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs, which is the official, publication of the ruling class, in which he said his concern for the future wasn't nuclear war, it was some kind of catastrophic environmental event. This is in the early 1980s. So, and he really became, it almost sounded like the new left people we've read. And then there's Jimmy Carter. And so that's what we want to talk about. He's done great stuff, but what we're going to do is tell you, like, how he became president and what he did as president, and how American politics is structured in a way that a good guy is never going to become president and never going to get close to that. You saw Bernie Sanders, right? Who, what we're seeing now from Biden is that Sanders and Warren aren't really all that different from a lot of the stuff we're seeing, other than Medicare for all, which would be pretty radical. What Biden's doing isn't all that dissimilar to what Warren and Sanders were talking about. So Jimmy Carter, as president, really fit well into that framework and laid the groundwork for Reagan, for Clinton, for this really pretty significant rightward drift that we've been seeing since the 60s and 70s, right? So I think Scott wants to lead off to talk a little bit about, well, we're going to start by talking about how who Jimmy Carter was and how he became president. And that involves the story of a group called the Trilateral Commission. So,
yep. And the Trilateral Commission is a term that you hear often in these conspiracy circles. You hear about the Rockefellers, and you hear about the Freemasons, and you hear about the Illuminati, and the Trilateral Commission is often
the stonecutters.
The stonecutters, exactly. So the Trilateral Commission is actually now equated to some grand globalist conspiracy, etc. But the important thing about the Trilateral Commission is it actually was a very influential body. It was a nonpartisan, non-governmental discussion group founded by David Rockefeller in 1973. And it was created to foster closer cooperation between Japan, Western Europe, and North America. And I'm going to actually read a quote. I'm going to start with a quote by one of our favorite people, which is Noam Chomsky. And Noam says, talking about the Trilateral Commission and the philosophy of the Trilateral Commission, is essentially liberal internationalists from Europe, Japan, and the United States, the liberal wing of the intellectual elite. That's where Jimmy Carter's whole government came from, the Trilateral Commission. The Trilateral Commission was concerned with trying to induce what they called more moderation in democracy, little d democracy. Turn people back to to be passive in obedience, so they don't put so many constraints on state power and so on. In particular, they were worried about young people. They were concerned about the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. That's their phrase, meaning schools, universities, church, and so on. They're not doing their job. The young are not being sufficiently indoctrinated. They're too free to pursue their own initiatives and concerns, and you've got to control them better. And so, like I said, the Trilateral Commission comes together in 1973. It is a group of private citizens from the elite circles, includes David Rockefeller, Brzezinski, Cyrus Vance. If you look at it in the spectrum of American politics, it's people from both parties, including William Scranton, who was a liberal Republican from Pennsylvania. He was the governor. And so essentially, when we talk about, and Bob and I actually met in the midst of an anti-corporate globalization movement about 20 years ago. There's a lot of critique of this phrase, which we actually need to do a show on, called Neo-Liberalism. And so what the Trilateral Commission did was it's one of those bodies which essentially managed the framework that led to this neoliberalism that rose up through the what we tend to think has happened during the Reagan years, but it actually happened during the Carter years. And that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about. Yeah. But it was a very influential body on governments, and it was a very influential body on the U.S. government. And it started with the administration of Jimmy Carter.
And Jimmy Carter, who was a peanut farmer, ran for governor of Georgia in 1974. He'd been in the state legislature, was elected governor, was a member of the Trilateral Commission. And some of those names there you mentioned, Zbigniew Brzezinski was the kind of director of the Trilateral Commission, became his version of Henry Kissinger. Cyrus Vance, I believe Griffin Bell may have been in it.
Brzezinski worked for Kissinger, correct?
Yeah, I think he did. Yeah, but he always thought he was smart. It's not saying much. But Brzezinski later in life actually became kind of a critical of like wars in the Middle East and things like that. But at any rate, and Carter was a member of this. And like you said, it's not a conspiracy. This is done in the open. I mean, they're having open meetings. Everybody knows about it. It's being covered in the media. Around that same time, there was another group called the Committee on the Present Danger, which was established to push for higher defense spending. So we should do a show about all this, because the left loves these conspiracies that they're not. They're just a bunch of people. And Jimmy Carter, impressed these people at the Trilateral Commission. At the time, he's really young. He's fresh. This is Watergate had just happened 2 years earlier. He was kind of unknown. And then he's the first person who really understood that the Iowa caucuses could be important. So he spent a lot of time in Iowa and won the caucuses. And all of a sudden, the Democrats were in disarray after 1972 and after Watergate. So kind of the usual suspects were running. You had Ed Muskie was allegedly the front runner, and he kind of fell apart. And I think, did McGovern run again? I can't remember now. And
McGovern seemed to be perpetually running.
there were 10 or 12 people. Fred Harris from Oklahoma, who was actually a good old populist.
Jerry Brown, Scoop
Jerry Brown,
Jackson.
Fred Harris had the best line. He said, the little people are going to elect me president. And like after 2 primaries, he dropped out. He said, the little people were too small to reach the voting levers. So, but, and Jimmy Carter emerged from that, and the ruling class loved him, right? Because, you know, in the aftermath of Watergate, there was this intense anger, and there was a real fear. Like Chomsky's quote says, like, the 60s scared the hell out of these people, right? The students are on campus and SDS and, you know, Black Panthers. And so they want to bring back this level of normalcy, and Carter is their guy, right? And, you know, as you said, you know, he kind of lays the groundwork, like his views on race, right, which are ironic, right? Because he's great. I mean, he's working with Stacey Abrams. He's been very outspoken on all racial issues, on police and everything. But that wasn't Jimmy Carter in 1976, was it?
No. And it's interesting. One thing I'm going to say to kind of prelude all of this is that a lot of what we attribute to Reagan, like policies and bringing in certain political views and things like that, a lot of it started with Carter. And so, for example, in 1976, when he was running for president, he's really known actually for what I believe he said when he launched his campaign, which was to be contrary to Nixon, which is like, I will never lie to you. But there's a lot of other interesting things he says in that campaign. And so, you know, Carter actually race baited during the 1976 election. So by the mid 70s, there had actually been a big push on busing, particularly in northern cities, but also in places like Charlotte. And so Carter came out and spoke out against that. And he was doing that during the 1976 primary and election to appeal to northern white ethnics and white Southerners. And he carried a majority of white Southern men in 1976 in the election, in the general election. But a quote that he said was, "I see nothing wrong with ethnic purity being maintained. I would not force a racial integration of a neighborhood by government action." And then a couple days later, when he was criticized for it by the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, he doubled down and he said, "What I say is that the government ought not to take as a major purpose the intrusion of alien groups into a neighborhood simply to establish their intrusion." And so
that's not really even coded language.
No.
And he and Jesse Jackson got into a very public pissing match about that when it happened.
And it you know, a lot of when Reagan announced his presidential run in, I believe, 1979, he did it at the Mississippi State Fairgrounds in blanking on the town in Mississippi, but it's, you know, near where the 3 civil rights workers were murdered in 1964. A lot of coded language in there about states' rights, blah, 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 etc. Carter predates that.
Carter also reached out to the evangelical community.
Philadelphia, Mississippi. That's where.
Carter also reached out to the evangelical religious community.
Yep. And
I believe met with Jerry Falwell, and
yep,
I think kind of got his blessing. Carter won a majority of evangelical votes. So today, when we talk about, you know, the horrors of these evangelicals and Trump, Carter started that.
Yeah, exactly. And the rise of the religious right didn't start with, they joined the Reagan coalition, the Reagan coalition, the Republican coalition in 1980, but they were actually part of the Carter coalition in 1976 to get him elected and to beat Ford, who was actually a bit of a liberal Republican, just to be clear.
Yeah, you know, in retrospect, as you look back on these things, like I was saying the other day, like, you know, it might have been better for everybody if Mitt Romney had won in 2012. And Ford, yeah, I mean, you know, Jerry Ford and me kind of, I roam around, but I remember, and I've said this, I've told you this story like probably more times you care to remember. Jerry Ford, I believe it was his first press conference, either as president or right after the pardon. And they talked about the pardon. And then somebody said there was a bill, a public spending bill, like a small amount, 15 billion or something like that. And they asked Jerry Ford about it. And he said, look, you know, we're in an economic, you know, we're in a stagnant economy. The federal government has a responsibility, an obligation to take care of people in times like this. I mean, can you imagine anybody, any Democrat from that point on, Clinton or Gore, or, you know, Biden's actually saying that now, which is kind of why some of these shows we've talked about, we're starting to see kind of some, you know, slight reversion back to these kind of corporate liberal ideas because the situation is so bad. But no, absolutely. Ford, in retrospect, when you look back, yeah, we might have been better off if he'd beaten Jimmy Carter, given the nature of what's happened since then.
Yeah, exactly. On the other domestic front that we wanted to touch on, is around economic policy. And so Carter was very much an fiscal conservative, not physical, but fiscal conservative, probably a physical conservative as well, but we won't go there.
He did give an interview to Playboy where he admitted to having lust in his heart for other women. So
yes,
I guess he was that. Would that make him a physical conservative too?
Yeah,
I remember Shirley MacLaine saying,
maybe in the Matt Gaetz context of the word.
I remember Shirley MacLaine saying it should really be a little lower than that. So.
Yeah. But Carter was a hardcore supply sider. And so when we're talking about supply side economics, we're talking about neoliberalism. We're talking about a macroeconomic theory that effectively wants to foster lower taxes, decreasing regulation, and free trade, right? And so everything that we have organized against just since Seattle, the WTO protests in Seattle, is essentially like supply side economics. And it's the governing philosophy of Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, and Obama and Trump.
And Carter had a kind of sketchy relationship, sometimes antagonistic relationship with the union, with labor because of that. Supply side means you take care of, you have supply and demand. Supply are the producers, demand are the consumers, right?
Right.
And basic Keynesian economics is basically demand side, which means, the basis of Keynes' idea is that you provide employment because employment gives people money and then they can become consumers. Supply side means you take care of the people at the top. Generally, it means you cut taxes. And then by doing that, you open that money for investment and that'll trickle down, right? So the unions still wanted good union contracts and they wanted good wages and they still were kind of living in that Keynesian economy. And Carter's really the first person. He had really antagonistic relationships with a lot of especially left labor, like the mechanics, the machinist union at the time, and a couple others. Wanted Teddy Kennedy to run. Chappaquiddick had made that impossible, but the liberal wing of the Democratic Party wanted Teddy Kennedy to run, and so they never really warmed to Carter, and Carter didn't warm to them.
No, we talk about the dismantling of the New Deal, even though all of these politicians run on how, an embrace of the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt, like Carter and Reagan, and say that, Reagan's noted for saying that FDR was one of his heroes when he was a young man. But they're actually the ones who began the dismantling of the regulatory systems that the New Deal policies had implemented. Reagan actually praised Carter in a column. One of the ways that Reagan, after he was governor of California, had a radio show, which would probably be a podcast in 2021, and then a column. And he actually had a column called "Give Carter a Chance," praising his fiscal conservatism. But Carter
and worth noting, in the 1976 election, Carter had been way ahead, like by 20 points, and barely won, eked it out.
Right.
But the Democrats that year had, a veto-proof Congress. Because of Watergate, they had 2/3 of the Senate and the House. And I don't know, I think FDR is the only other time that it happened.
Right.
So he had incredible political juice, much like Obama did in 2009.
Yeah.
And he essentially went to war against the liberal wing of his own party.
Yeah. And there were a number of things that he did that pissed off the liberal wing of his party. Deregulation was actually a big one. There was moves around with the Interstate Commerce Commission to deregulate trucking and railroads. There was a deregulation move against Ma Bell, the phone companies, and then there was also a deregulation. There was deregulation moves around the oil sector as well, and
airlines
and airlines as well.
In 1980, there were, I think, something like 29 domestic carriers, and within a decade and a half, it was down to, when you were working in your old corporate life, what was there, like 5 or 6 major carriers?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
But then we also had the rise of the low cost carriers. This is mid to late 90s, which were really challenging.
He deregulated trucking, which meant which really hurt wages among truckers,
and put him at odds with the Teamsters.
With the Teamsters union, right? And the Teamsters, I think, didn't the Teamsters endorse Reagan in 1980?
Yes,
I believe
they did.
Might have, yeah.
Yeah, they did. One thing I want to say about the oil sector is is, there were a couple different schools of thought here. Is like, Ted Kennedy, who was becoming the leader of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, was essentially advocating nationalization of the oil industry, where Reagan was calling for complete deregulation. And so Carter took a middle road. And we, in prepping for this episode, Bob and I found Bob found an article in Mises by some unknown academic who I don't remember his name.
If you don't know, Ludwig von Mises was one of the Austrian economists, hardcore conservative, libertarian, no regulation, no laws, basically. So the Mises Institute is kind of as far out there as you can get.
Let's take us back to feudalism.
Oh yeah. This is, Milton Friedman and then Hayek and all those guys, right? The Austrians, right?
Yeah.
They are the sworn mortal enemies of the Keynesians, right? And I'm looking around and I find this article from some guy in the Mises Institute newsletter praising Jimmy Carter.
The title of the article is "Rethinking Carter," but there's a great quote in it. Do you want to read that?
Yeah. The last line here, and he basically praises him for all the reasons we just gave: deregulation and limiting spending on infrastructure and things like that. Like the infrastructure bill today, that was an issue in the late 1970s, spending on infrastructure. So you can imagine, like, a lot of that stuff we're talking about today hasn't been touched, bridges and roads, and now we have, internet and things like that. The one line you had, Scott always prepares notes for this. He does all the heavy lifting. But at the time, Ma Bell, a copper wire could carry 15 calls, and today a single fiber optic line can carry 2 million calls. So that's the kind of infrastructure we were talking about at the time. But the last line in this article in the von Mises Institute newsletter is, however, Carter actually made it easier for Reagan to take the actions he did. If the Democrats wish to lionize one of their own as the creator of the new economy, they should be looking at Jimmy Carter, not Bill Clinton. And other than you and I, and some lefty economists and historians, people like Noam Chomsky, I've never heard anybody say that. So we are on the same side as the Austrians on this one.
I've aspired to that for a long time. So.
I know, right?
and so it's really important, like thinking about this in terms of the Tri-Lateral Commission, what they did, thinking about Carter's conservative economic politics. There was also, the other thing I want to talk about just touch on really quick, and Bob kind of touched on this, is the Democratic Party is very polarized in this moment. And so there's a pretty strong liberal wing, which is led by Ted Kennedy, George McGovern, people like that. And they're in deep conflict with this more conservative wing of the party, which is led by Carter. And so clearly Carter had won the primaries. He had been able to win the election by making a pre-Reagan coalition, Carter coalition. And this is also a story that it continues to play out today. You could see it as being more about the wing that's led by Rahm Emanuel and Obama-ites versus the Sanders AOC wing, right? With
Absolutely.
Biden somewhere in the middle. And so it's Ryan Grimm, who's a DC bureau chief for The Intercept, actually wrote a great book that came out just a couple of years ago called "We've Got the People," or "We Got People," which is essentially at least a 40-year history of this struggle. He starts also in 1980 about the struggle between the liberal left wing and the conservatives, mainstream establishment Democrats. But just very important thing to kind of think about the context. There, we could also look at the Republicans and we can see the splits there as well, and that's actually playing out very publicly right now. But just the context of what happens with the Democrats and their political divisions is very important.
And what that does with Carter is Carter and Reagan move everybody to the right. So that when we talk about centrist Democrats back in the early 1970s, those guys were like liberal Republicans, right?
Right.
So Carter is really pivotal. And not that I'm a seer, because a lot of people were saying this in 2016. I said, no matter who wins, I think you're looking at a Jimmy Carter presidency, like a one-term, kind of really lackadaisical malaise. Who knew it would be so tumultuous? But the fact is, we were right. But Carter's presidency is not looked on favorably. He was at war with his own party. In fact, Teddy Kennedy ran in the primaries against him in 1980, which is really bad whenever you have a primary challenge. Just like when Pat Buchanan, remember, ran fairly strongly against George Bush in 92. You
Right.
kind of knew George Bush was done for.
Or when Sanders ran pretty strongly against
in
Hillary in
2016.
2016.
Yeah. Carter defeated Kennedy because he had the mechanism of the party behind him. But by that time, you had just the country, you had these energy problems, and he was advocating kind of this, he did these fireside chats, remember, and he talked about malaise and all that. Like a lot of lefties liked him because he was friends with Bob Dylan and Willie Nelson. Like, he let Willie Nelson smoke weed at the White House, and he would quote Dylan all the time, right? But the reality was that the country wasn't doing well. And then the big bomb came, I think, with regard to, and we can do this as a segue into the foreign policy stuff, which is what my article was actually about. The big bomb was Iran. It occurred in the Middle East. Iran had become America's, along with Israel and Saudi to some extent, but even more Iran. And we talked about this, remember, a few weeks ago, that really great show we did with Eskandar. And we have to do another show on Iran because the things aren't getting, different there. Obviously, you just had this hack by Israel. Israel is trying to muck up any opportunity to create, and it's not like Biden's eager to do it anyway, but Israel's really mucking up every chance to kind of create any kind of stability in that region. But you have the revolution in Iran, the Islamic Revolution with Khomeini. Prior to that, under the Nixon, in the Nixon years, the U.S. had established Iran as kind of a client state. Well, it hasn't been a client state, but kind of a protector in the Middle East. See, the United States, there are a couple, I'm being professor here, forgive me. There are kind of a couple schools of thought on the U.S. role in the Middle East, and especially with regard to Israel. So a lot of people say, well, the United States supports Israel because of domestic politics, right? AIPAC and the vote and all that. But then you have another school, and Chomsky's part of that, and I think he's right, and I've seen documents from Nixon, which says that the United States supports Israel because Israel does America's dirty work in the region. It's like the cop. It's their Derek Chauvin. Israel is America's Derek Chauvin. Well, so was Iran. And between 1973 and 1978, Iran received $19 billion in weapons from the United States. The Shah of Iran was as reliable an ally in the region as you could get, really vicious, brutal regime. And then you had this domestic opposition to the Shah emerge, the Mujahideen, which is basically a word that means freedom fighter. The Mujahideen included a lot of young people who were influenced by not just pan-Arabism like the Nasserite type, but by Marx and communism. Remember, the 70s is a time where there's a global left, right? Mao Zedong before that, and then you had Fidel and Ho, the Vietnamese Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, Mandela, the national, I'm talking about.
The ANC,
so,
the African National
ANC.
Congress.
There are these leftist movements all over, and we'll talk about some of them, because as President, Carter's move is to defeat those movements. So Iran is blown up, and Carter sides with the Shah. The Shah was diagnosed with cancer. He let him come into the United States for treatment at Johns Hopkins. And I forget who it was. It was, Kissinger, who wasn't in his cabinet. Kissinger pressured him, but it may have been Cyrus Vance. It doesn't matter. One of his cabinet members says, if you side with the Shah and let him in the country, you realize what this is going to do inside Iran. And I'm not sure, but I'm going to say it anyway, because it's a great story. One of them, I almost remember somebody saying, what are you going to do when they take the embassy? So they were aware that America's relationship with the Shah was toxic, and it was going to lead to an upheaval in Iran, and it did. And so, in the aftermath of the United States supporting the Shah leaves. There's a kind of a mini uprising. There's a new government in Iran, I believe, led by Ghutsbadeh. And then Khomeini returns from exile in Paris, and you have the creation of that first Islamic Republic. With that comes the second of the so-called oil shocks of the 1970s. The first was in 1973 with the Arab-Israeli War. And then in 1979, you had the second. So there's this Arab oil embargo. Inflation blows up. This would also lead, we didn't talk about it in the first part, this also led to the appointment of Paul Volcker the head of the Federal Reserve, and Volcker was a hardcore hawk on inflation, which, inflation for poor people isn't a bad thing. If inflation is done right, wages are raised and your debts are actually cost less because money isn't worth as much. So for poor people, inflation is not that bad, which is, I think, the basis of a lot of these MMT people. I'm not an advocate of that, just to make it clear. So the oil shocks and then the takeover of the American embassy sealed Carter's fate. He appeared weak. He decided to stay in the Rose Garden and not leave. He was kind of a hostage. That was the word they was always using, hostage of the Rose Garden. He attempted, against the advice of Cyrus Vance, who was a Secretary of State, he attempted a rescue mission in the desert.
National Security Advisor.
Not Security Advisor, I'm sorry. Secretary of State was, no, it was Vance. Brzezinski was
I got him mixed up.
Yeah. Attempted a rescue mission in the desert, which was a disaster. The helicopters went down, everybody died. Vance resigned in protest against it. So Carter was just in dismal shape. So, the election was still close, but it was just a disaster. Carter lost heavily. And then a bunch of establishment liberal Democrats, McGovern lost, Frank Church lost, I think Gaylord Nelson lost. Really, didn't they lose 11 Senate seats?
Yeah, Mike Gravel.
Right. In my brilliant predictions, I was saying that the last year's election could be like that for the Republicans. I was predicting like this massive Republican defeat. So,
but then, although we were betting on the Democrats, which is probably
when you're like I said, when you're playing the Washington Generals, you're never out of the game, right? We're seeing that right now. Going back to the very beginning when we talked about Derek Chauvin, there was a poll today. Over 60% of Americans are saying the police are racist and they need to be scrutinized more heavily on every major. I mean, Biden is 59-38 in the latest Pew poll, right? Those are numbers. Trump never hit 50%. So the Democratic Party has big majorities on, like, what is it? 2/3 of Americans say, tax everybody over 400,000, right? This is the Democratic Party.
And corporations.
Yeah, they are the Washington Generals of politics. And that was clearly the case then. And in 1980, it was just they got destroyed. And that's kind of a segue, unless you have something else we could talk about. Carter's foreign policy, that's the basis of the article I wrote last November. Jimmy Carter's a liberal saint now, was a war criminal then. And it's my field. It's the area I study more closely, although I kind of anything after any aspect of American politics, especially in the 20th century and onward, I think Scott and I, that's our wheelhouse: liberalism, political economy, things like that. We are, I think people say we're the best political podcast ever as well. So I'm pretty
We've
sure
definitely made it into the top 10% of all
at least
podcasts.
in the top 10%. Right.
Or at least in the top 10%.
Watch out, Chapo. Watch out, Chapo. We're coming for you. We are coming for Chapo, man.
And we're much more interesting. We're much more interesting.
Donate. That's right, man. This is our Stop Chapo campaign, right?
So we're like the anti-hipsters.
The anti-hipsters campaign. We are too old to be hipsters, right? Well, I am.
We're more like hipsters, not hipsters.
Hipsters, in honor of our executive producer and the champion of the working class, our friend Hep, who we're going to have on a show at some point again. Anyway, I don't want to go into great detail on this, but Carter's foreign policy fit within that new reinvigorated Cold War framework. Remember, Richard Nixon, went to China, right? Nixon, who had been like a hardcore Cold Warrior, became a senator based on his attachment to McCarthyism and, all that kind of rhetoric. He ended the Vietnam War for what it was worth, blew the hell out of Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, but he also ended the war. He created that détente, right? To create these relationships with both the Soviet Union and China in order to kind of break. There never was that communist bloc, but he broke that. He also used it against Vietnam. And then, he had actually come to an agreement with the Soviet Union on nuclear weapons, the strategic arms limitation talks, and then was in negotiations for another, even more rigorous cutback on nuclear weapons, SALT II. And SALT II was in the works when Watergate happened, and then Ford picked it up. And that's when, if we ever do a show on the Committee for the Present Danger, we can talk about their role in scuttling SALT II. Basically, American military contractors, defense intellectuals, people in the military were afraid that if you start reducing, nuclear weapons, you're not going to have as much business, right? One of the things that Nixon did after Vietnam, because defense spending went down so dramatically, was really pump up arms sales, which is why like Iran got, $19 billion in weapons in just a 4 or 5 year period. So Jimmy Carter became president. Carter, even before Reagan, we usually talk about Reagan and the new Cold War. It actually is before that. So Jimmy Carter is to the right of the previous administration. And in fact, during one of the debates in 1976, Carter debated Gerald Ford. And this is like one of the big moments that then Ford was considered to have blown it. They were talking about Eastern Europe, and Gerald Ford said during a debate, Carter said that this administration, he was attacking Ford from the right, which is what Kennedy did to Nixon in 1960 on Cuba. Jimmy Carter said that Nixon-Ford administration has been soft on communism, right? They have allowed the Soviet Union to dominate Poland and Czechoslovakia and all these countries. Jerry Ford, in response, said, I don't think you can say that the countries of Eastern Europe are dominated by the Soviet Union. In fact, he's right. I mean, they're clearly under there was more autonomy and more flexibility in those Eastern European regimes than the US media portrayed, right? It was more than just a boot. That was there. But, Brezhnev wasn't Stalin and the US.
And more that's taught in public schools.
Yeah. So Ford really wasn't that far. Carter pounced on that. And that was really big because Ford, that was like a really body blow to Gerald Ford. So Carter scored mega points by attacking Ford from the right and being, this anti-con. So Carter's staking out a position far to the right of Nixon. So, just let that sink in for a minute. Just as Kennedy did in 1960 on things like Cuba.
And the Republicans after Carter never, maybe arguably in more recent times, never let the Democrats get to the right of them again on such things.
Yeah, although they tried.
Yeah, they tried.
Yeah, and I think that's the one weird thing about Trump, right? You have all these liberals now who have become like big advocates of NATO, and they hate Russia and they hate China, and all. And Russia and China are clearly autocratic. I mean, I think China's actually a fascist state. People love to throw that word around. China is far more fascist than anything you've seen in the U.S. With the way that corporations are run and the states run and all that kind of stuff. At any rate, so Carter did that. Now let's just give some examples of that, and we can just do it. And if you're interested, you can go read the whole article at afflictthecomfortable.org and just do a search.
And we're going to put it in the show notes as well.
We'll put it in the show notes too. All right. So you want to just kind of go by the order in which it's structured there. We can start with like Indonesia, and I assume you have it opened, or
why don't you start? And
okay. And I just did it based on kind of some of the key elements of Carter's foreign policy. I did not include Iran because that's kind of what and I didn't really include Israel because it's only after he became president that he became so critical of Israel, which I think he should be absolutely lauded for. It's really remarkable to use the word apartheid in a title of a book about Israel is really really something for somebody who had been president of the United States, right? You're not going to hear that very often. I mean, look at AOC, the way she stumbles and jibber jabbers when they ask her about Israel, right? So I want to start with Indonesia and East Timor, which we've talked about before, and we're going to have a show on that coming forward. I'm reading this amazing book right now called Buried Histories about the Indonesian massacres of the 60s. So, and Americans know a bit about that. When we interviewed Clinton Fernandez about Nome for our Chomsky birthday spectacle, which has done quite well, by the way, he talked a lot about Indonesia and Timor because Clinton's an advocate and a scholar in Australia who studies this very closely. There's this idea that the U.S. looked away in Indonesia while they slaughtered people in East Timor, tens of thousands. That's true. It's true. And Jimmy Carter was a big part of that. Timor was an ex-Portuguese colony that Indonesia wanted to annex. Timor wanted independence. The Carter administration supported and provided heavy aid, military, financial, and diplomatic, to Jakarta. So that kind of whole Jakarta method thing that all these people and the stuff we're going to talk about, the book I'm reading is actually better than the Jakarta method. It's called Buried Histories by John Rusa. But Carter was a big advocate and an important piece in that, what we would call the Jakarta method. Today, Indonesian troops in East Timor were armed roughly 90% with our equipment, one Department of State report acknowledged. So the Indonesians were killing the Timorese with American-made weapons, which is unfortunately going to be kind of one of the themes of the Carter years. As the Indonesians were running out of military material, Carter authorized additional arms sales of $112 million just in 1978. And since Walter Mondale was the kind of genesis of this, sent Mondale to Jakarta to announce these new arms sales, and continued to deny throughout that the situation in East Timor was dangerous. So Carter had a huge role to play in the slaughter and the massacre and the denial of sovereignty to East Timor. And that led to a bloodbath that would continue until, when did the Timorese get independence? I can't remember.
99, 2000.
Yeah, I've written about it too. I have another piece on my blog about that. It was on December 7th, 1975, I think, was the invasion.
Right.
And so Carter was president during most of that time, right?
So the occupation lasts 25-ish years.
Yeah. And the U.S. support throughout. U.S. supported throughout.
It was in 99. It was in 99 when they
I think so.
finally got independence.
And there were like massacres and so on. And these were all, heavily subsidized by Washington, D.C., by Jimmy Carter and by Bill Clinton. If you want to talk about Democrats, Clinton was on board just as well.
Yep.
Angola. Oh.
Yeah. I was going to take that one.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah,
I was going to stop. I was throwing it to you, actually. So.
Sorry, missed our cues there.
I didn't know we had any.
Southwest Africa, Angola, and South Africa. Carter continued U.S. policy in supporting the apartheid regime in South Africa. There had been a Marxist government had taken over in Angola, and there was actually a reactionary rebel front called UNITA, which was led by a pretty notable figure named Jonas Savimbi, and who basically waged war from South Africa against the Marxist government in Angola. Kind of going back to the Nixon-Kissinger triangulation is, the U.S. actually makes a deal with the Chinese to send 800 tons of military equipment to support UNITA. But, lots of battles that included air attacks, raids on refugee camps, a massacre at Kasinga in 1978, in which U.S.-backed forces killed 800 people. I also want to note that there was the sort of triangulation going on here is that the Marxist government's actually backed by the Soviet Union, and that is where they get a lot of their supplies. And it also included a brigade of international fighters, which were Cuban, who actually went and fought UNITA with the Marxist government for many years. And we're going to talk a little bit about Cuba as well by the end of this episode.
Yeah, and Cuba, we need to do another show there because in the 1970s, especially, and I was talking about this recently because Raul Castro stepped down, so there's not a Castro now in official position in the Communist Party or in the government of Cuba. The Cubans were part of that solidarity, they called it tricontinental, the U.S. had the Tri-Lateral Commission for the left. It was tricontinentalism, and the Cubans were really active in Angola. They were vital to the liberation. Angola finally did gain its independence, and Cuban troops played a huge role in that. The famous Battle of Quito Carnaval, and I've written about that. There's actually I have a blog on that. Just you can do a search on. We can put it in the show notes, or you can do a search on it. But and the important piece to this, which I can't stress enough, because we're going to talk about it in a second with the next thing we talk about, is the United States is working with China, right? Mao died, I think, in 1975. So Deng Xiaoping took over and began this, Mao would have called him a capitalist roader, right? And also kind of reoriented China's foreign policy. So the United States and the Chinese were working very closely now. And they were on the same side. Savimbi had once been a Maoist. Savimbi was a brutal terrorist thug, right? The U.S. is supporting him, as is China. And the United States and China are coordinating support to essentially to South Africa. I mean, the U.S. and China were both supporting this apartheid regime in Southern Africa, not just in South Africa itself, but also in Angola and Namibia and throughout the southern part of the continent. So Jimmy Carter, who's obviously has these great ideas about race and everything else, was defending more than defending, arming the apartheid regimes in those places, right? Which is what, and that's the point. Carter's a great guy, but this is what American presidents do, right? I mean, if Carter had said, we're going to support the MPLA, we're going to support the Marxists, well, we're never, he would have been like, they would have invoked the 25th Amendment on him, you can incite a riot and get away with it, right? They've gotten away with it, right? But if you were to do that, people would think you're robots or pazzo, as my people would say. All right. Speaking of China, that leads to the area that I actually know best, which is Vietnam. And Vietnam War was over, right, by the time Jimmy Carter became president. But that did not mean that America's relationships or American policies with that region, Indochina, were not important. In fact, in one of Carter's first press conferences in 1977, somebody asked him if the United States should make reparations to Vietnam, if the United States should do something to help Vietnam because of all the intense and immense destruction. Vietnam is about the size of New Mexico and had how many million tons of bombs dropped on it, 15 million refugees, just devastated. And Carter said no. And his reasoning is, to me, chilling. He said the destruction was mutual. That's how Jimmy Carter looked at the Vietnam War. The destruction was mutual. The U.S. invaded Vietnam. The U.S. killed 2 to 3 million Vietnamese. The United States, I mean, to this day, in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, over 10,000 people a year die still from unexploded bombs from that war. And for Jimmy Carter, the United States owed the Vietnamese nothing because the destruction was mutual, which is utterly chilling, I think. He continued to go after the new government. Vietnam was renamed the SRV, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. And remember, in 1975, next door, there had been a revolution. There have been revolutions in all three of the countries of Indochina, Laos, Cambodia, Kampuchea, and Vietnam at the same time. And they all came to power in late April 1975, literally within like a week or 10 days of each other. And the most brutal regime was in Kampuchea, the Khmer Rouge, and you've been there, so you can speak to it. And those pictures are utterly chilling, right? The killing fields. So the Khmer Rouge have this bizarre sense of communism led by Pol Pot.
And they were a Maoist sect as well, right?
Yeah, and they, just went on I forget what was the overall population of Cambodia, like 6-7 million or something like that. It wasn't that big.
Yeah.
And they killed perhaps 1 million people.
Right.
Just these, like, if you wore glasses, you were considered Western. If you spoke French, you were considered Western. So they wanted to eliminate that. I've met several years ago, somebody was going through Houston and I met this older guy who was a musician. And when he was like 10 years old, the Khmer Rouge killed his parents and gave him a gun, and he had to fight in the Khmer Rouge army, right? Now, and remember, this comes on the heels of the American Air War against Cambodia, which was highly destructive too, which really laid the groundwork. The Khmer Rouge was kind of a splinter, not really that important, until the United States started bombing the shit out of Cambodia and then really propelled the Khmer Rouge into power. So they've had these twin horrors, as bad as anything really in the 20th century when you consider how small Cambodia was, the US attacks, and then the Khmer Rouge, right? And Carter, and so the Vietnamese, and you can say, well, they did it. They're different. They've never been the same type of communist, right? The Vietnamese and the Cambodians, right? There had been tension there when Ho Chi Minh was still alive. So it was the Vietnamese who intervened to get rid of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, right? And it doesn't, to me, like the motivation, whatever, if you want to use the phrase humanitarian intervention, that's an Orwellian term. But if you're going to use it, this is where you use it, because they did end the genocides,
the killing fields
in Cambodia. And what did Carter do? Carter talked to China, and I've written an article about this. We can put that in the notes too, in some detail about the United States and China in the late 70s. Carter and China in the late 70s, because there's documents on it now. And in January of 1979, less than a year after the Vietnamese had intervened to get rid of the Khmer Rouge, Carter was talking to Deng Xiaoping again and expressed his desire to punish Vietnam, to reduce aid to Hanoi as long as the Vietnamese are the invaders, right? So he wants to set up a pretext. His thing is Vietnam has invaded Cambodia, right? And they got rid of this murderous regime that was killing hundreds of thousands of people. But in Carter's world, they're the invaders. He's talking to China. China and Vietnam have long been adversaries, right? Even though China supported Vietnam during the war. Carter increased military aid to Thailand, to a group called ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And he got them all to unite against the government in Hanoi and warned the Soviet Union that if they continued to support Hanoi, that would harm relations with the United States. Carter is going full on imperial hawk here. I mean, this is war criminal stuff here. You're supporting the Khmer Rouge. And then remember, when Reagan became president, Jeane Kirkpatrick went to the UN to defend the Khmer Rouge seat, saying the Khmer Rouge should hold this seat at the United Nations, not the government put into place by the Vietnamese. Deng Xiaoping agreed and said some punishment in a short period of time will put a restraint on Vietnamese ambitions. The United States and the Chinese are trying to restrain Vietnam. This country's just been devastated by war, can't get international lending. The United States, Nixon had a secret codicil to give the Vietnamese, I think, $2.5 billion in reparations, which he said, well, I'm not going to give it to them because they still have POWs, which was an utter lie. There are no POWs and MIAs. That, those flags are based on an utter lie. They're every public building in the United States.
It flies over the post office in Berkeley, California today.
Yep. And that is
a propaganda campaign.
A myth. There's a good book on that by Bruce Franklin, an outstanding scholar, called MIA, or Myth Making in America. And that's from Rambo and, all those goofy movies and all that stuff.
And Ross Perot.
Yeah. So Carter said that he understood that China wanted to get rid of Vietnam and invade, but he said an invasion of Vietnam would be a very serious destabilizing force. Deng Xiaoping said, "We have noted what you said to us, that you want us to be restrained. It is not that we did not consider this. We intend a limited action. Our troops will quickly withdraw. We'll deal with it like a border incident." Right? That's not cryptic. Deng Xiaoping is telling Jimmy Carter that the Chinese are going to invade Vietnam. Carter doesn't say anything. All right. That's a green light. And in February of 1979, I don't know how many people know this. This is really important stuff that more people need to know. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops in February of 1979 attacked along the Vietnamese border and invaded Vietnam. The incursion only lasted about a month because the Vietnamese basically kicked their ass. Don't mess with Vietnam, right? It was costly. The Chinese had about 25,000 or more killed. The Vietnamese probably more than that. Financially, however, the toll was great. And this is when you talk about Vietnam after the war, the financial burdens, not just of not getting international lending, but of occupying Cambodia and of fighting against the Vietnamese was really immense. And I mean, there's a great deal of criticism that the Vietnamese government, Pham Van Dong and others, deserve. They mishandled winning very badly. And Gabriel Kolko has written a great book about this called Anatomy of a Peace. But the burden of fighting against China after the intervention was huge. And Carter was a huge part, the main force behind that. Carter greenlit the attack on Vietnam because of the intervention, the humanitarian intervention in Cambodia, and then worked with the Chinese to physically invade Vietnam. And the Vietnamese economy never really recovered from that until it started this kind of heavy duty capitalist, the Doi Moi, which was kind of like what Gorbachev was doing.
Perestroika is the Vietnamese
it's like the
perestroika.
Right. It's a market-oriented thing. So they basically abandoned socialism. They abandoned the people who had won the war, the labor and the veterans and things like that. So it's a sad story, like all around.
Yeah. Doi Moyes and perestroika are essentially
pretty much the same thing.
Deregulation, neoliberalism.
Yeah. Now the I think the last thing on this, or no, there's the next last, and I can point to the flag behind me, which I've had up there for a while now. A friend of mine brought this back in 1984 to Managua, and it's a flag of the Sandinista government there, the FSLN, which they're in power today, but they're a lot different. Let's just leave it at that than they were then. But the FSLN came to power against Jimmy Carter's wishes, did it not?
Oh yeah, absolutely. One real quick thing I want to just like kind of point back to is when we at the beginning of the episode, we talked about the Tri-Lateral Commission, and we talked about these global frameworks that, you know, spans Western Europe, North America, and Japan. And so these machinations where the Carter administration is doing grand strategic moves with the Chinese in Southwest Africa or Vietnam or Cambodia and a number of other places is like that's part of the plan. And you know, the thought, what's coming from the liberal internationalist wing of the global elite, which is represented in the Trilateral Commission, is like that's what's happening here. Is like we don't commit U.S. troops per se to Southwest Africa or Vietnam. We are, you know, supporting, you know, people who we perceive as our friend under these certain circumstances. And but I actually think it's a Chinese saying made from Sun Tzu, is like the enemy of my enemy is my friend, which is essentially it's a real simple way of kind of talking about why the U.S. developed relations with the Chinese. Yeah.
And let me just throw one thing in there too, because when the Trilateral Commission was established, it was really about Japan and Asia. No one foresaw what would happen after Mao died. So, you know, the entreaties and the, you know, cooperation between the United States and Beijing was insane. Like that was unbelievable. And that was a huge bonus for these people who had kind of created this idea. You know, like the Trilateral Commission is like the Council on Foreign Relations or something like that. It's these guys who, and, you know, no one in 1973, no one could have said, oh, you know, 6 years from now, we're going to be cooperating with China to support apartheid and attack Vietnam, right?
Genocide in Cambodia.
And genocide in Cambodia, right. So this is, I mean, if you want to kind of, I don't like giving moral evaluations of foreign policy because I just don't see any point to it, but these are evil motherfuckers. They really are. So,
yeah. And so the next little theater of operations, I guess we could say, is going to be in the U.S.'s own backyard, which is Nicaragua. And, you know, we had a recent episode with Professor Phil Berryman, former priest, talking about his experience as both a priest in Central America in the 70s and then as an activist with the American Friends Service Committee. But, you know, not enough. Reagan is very attached to the bloody wars in Central America in the 80s. And frankly, I think Bob and I would both agree that not enough people talk about that. But then Carter also, you know, talking about how the Carter administration policies were a prelude to what Reagan did, is like Carter was also a player in what happened in Nicaragua. And while the Contra War and U.S. destruction in Nicaragua and other parts of Central America is mostly a product of the Reagan administration, Carter sets the stage for that in the summer of 1979, when the Sandinista revolution made its final push to take over Managua and depose the dictator Somoza. They were actually part of a large popular front group, which was a whole bunch of different components. The Carter administration, which actually supported throwing out Somoza because he was such a brutal dictator, basically didn't like that it was being led by Soviet-backed communists, the Sandinistas, and push for moderate positions actually led to like kind of splitting up of that coalition, which was like created a whole lot of problems. And basically when the Sandinistas front, the FSLN, they're on Bob's wall. You can see if you're watching this on YouTube, took over in July of 1979, and they began receiving aid from other socialist states, most notably the Soviet Union. Carter authorized the CIA to begin to support resistance forces in Nicaragua, which is the genesis of the Contra War. And so there's a lot of popular media, and most notably in the film Salvador by Oliver Stone, that like the Carter administration was doing the right thing in many ways, because before the Reagan people came in, but Carter's actually very responsible for a lot of the bloodshed that happened in Central America during the 80s as well. When
I tell liberals that Carter created the Contras, they're in utter, like, they get angry. It's like I can show you documents. I've shown the documents, and it doesn't matter. One thing I want to say though, because we also did the show about the nuns, remember, in December. To Carter's credit, he's the first person who kind of established human rights as an issue in American foreign policy. Actually created an assistant secretary of state for human rights, Pat Darien. And when we talked about El Salvador, like Robert White was really outspoken about the regime there and the death squads and Dobie-San and things like that. So Carter did have that in him. And like in Argentina, he played a role in ending the dirty war there, and the disappeared. And in Argentina, they speak very well of him. So I don't want to, again, like he's not like individually in his heart. I'm sure he's a great guy. He's kind and caring, and he's certainly done amazing things since he's left the White House. But he was an American president, and that's, and all of that entails. So the last things we're going to do, because this has gone on, but it's good stuff. It's really good stuff. Are kind of two of his longest lasting legacies, which are Iraq and Afghanistan. And we can just have a kind of conversation on this. When I teach toward the end of the semester, usually the last semester, I do a really long backgrounder on the United States and the Middle East as kind of a prelude to why 9/11 happened. I set it up that way.
And we had an episode on that as well.
Well, yeah, that's right, for 9/11. Yeah, we did, which we can have an encore next year on 9/11. And when I talk about Iraq and Afghanistan, the students, this is the one time, like not one, but this is clearly one of the times during the semester where they're like jolted, right? Because, Iraq and Afghanistan, the way we look at them now, Iraq, I'm not sure how much is there. The United States had supported the Baathists. They helped them overthrow the government in 1963. They had kind of a tenuous relationship with them for a time. Henry Kissinger was sending money to the Kurds to overthrow Saddam Hussein, but then realized that wasn't going to happen. So we withdrew aid. And I basically tell the story because it's one of my favorite Kissinger quotes. When they asked him why he was no longer supporting the Kurds, he said, "Covert operations is not missionary work," right? And then Saddam went in and gassed.
Is that like a Kissinger impression you're trying to do there?
Yeah, it wasn't obvious?
It was a little subtle. Okay.
I'm not a ventriloquist. I can give you, if it was an Italian accent, I could have done it a lot better. But he also said that, what was it? Chile as a dagger aimed at Antarctica, right? We are not going to let Chile go socialist due to the stupidity of its own voters, right? And this guy was dating Jill St. John. I don't get it. Anyway, in Iraq, the Islamic Revolution in Iran made Iraq a lot more important. And Iraq and Iran had all kinds of disputes over the Shatt al-Arab waterway and borders and different types of, Islam and stuff like that. Anyway, there is no documentary evidence of it, but there's like a lot of heavy duty innuendo and speculation and stories that in 1980, Carter's people talked to Saddam Hussein and essentially greenlit his attack on Iran. Remember, 1980, a brutal, long, bloody war between Iraq and Iran began. And the United States, which would in the 1990s call Saddam Hussein the new Hitler and talk about WMDs and all the horrible things he was going to do. In 1980, when Jimmy Carter was still president, Iraq, with heavy American support, invaded Iran. And throughout that 8-9 years of war got like $40 billion of aid from the United States. So this green light, the US green lit the war, is still kind of speculative, but it is clear that the Reagan program to support Baghdad did not emerge just out of nowhere, right? So there's that. And then Afghanistan, I think, is the big one where Carter's Cold War, talons really came out. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, just that, Carter took just to back up there, I mean, and this is what we talk about in the episode of around 9/11, is that there had been a Soviet intervention after a Marxist government was established, and there was internal dispute over that between like what we later would call the Mujahideen and the new Marxist government. So the Soviets actually staged an intervention. The right people on the right in the U.S. would call it an invasion, but it was like an intervention supporting the government.
Just let me say one thing. And when that happened, in the pages of the New York Times, George Frost Kennan wrote an op-ed saying, "This is none of America's business. This is part of the Soviet Union sphere. The government they overthrew is actually far more extreme and far more right-wing than the government they put into power." And Kennan said, "Stay the hell out."
Right. And going against the ruling class in which he had been a part of and had supported for decades before that, or decades.
Yeah.
And so what happens is that Carter takes a harder line there, right? And so he begins funding the Mujahideen, kind of like the way he began funding the Contras around Nicaragua. But then he also, on the international stage of what I would call like the public relations stage, or how things are perceived, Carter boycotts the 1980 Olympics, which were scheduled to happen in Moscow. He dramatically increased military spending for the 1980-1981 budget, which becomes another prologue for the Reagan administration of increased military budgets. And then, like I said, they support in a really strong way the Mujahideen, which is the resistance against the Soviet intervention and the Marxist government in Kabul. And one of the sort of main groups of people they begin to recruit for this are hardline Islamic fundamentalists, which Reagan continues this, probably puts even more money into it, leads to the rise of Al-Qaeda, for example, which are like foreign fighters who are from other parts of the Middle East who come, most notably Osama bin Laden. And then the only other thing I'll say is that Brzezinski actually went to the Pakistan-Afghan border. This is his national security advisor, and told the Mujahideen fighters that God is on their side. And that
we should have queued that up. And although we played it in the 911, and we'll put that in too. Yeah, that's an amazing video.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and
I'm sorry, go ahead.
The only other thing I'll say is that this is what led to both the creation of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, which are mortal enemies of the U.S.
No, that's like the United States supported Saddam Hussein. Well, it created the Contras. Carter supported Saddam Hussein in 1980, and then like later turned on him, right? And then helped create, and Carter, this is Jimmy Carter, helped create Al-Qaeda and Taliban. The Brzezinski video is really striking. He lands in a helicopter. He's near the I think Kashmir, right? And then he's talking to these fundamentalist Muslims, and he said that's your country. Those are your mosques. You will return there because God is on your side. So when the United States says, fundamentalist Islam is our enemy and it's a clash of civilizations, and speaking of clash of civilizations, another person who was really important in the Trilateral Commission was Sam Huntington. Mm-hmm. And if you don't know who Sam Huntington is, you should. He was one of the hardcore, like people like Kissinger and Brzezinski, became political appointees and they held positions. Huntington didn't, but they all came out of academics, right? Harvard especially. Huntington was called Mad Dog Sam. He's the guy who believed that you should like go in and just destroy urban areas in Vietnam to get rid of the Viet Cong. So he's a bad guy too. So
Harvard professor.
Yeah, yeah. So, this idea that it's a class of civilizations or that Muslims are the enemies is insane, because that's who the United States was funding, and that's who Jimmy Carter was funding against. And now he is a big supporter of Palestinian rights and so on. But the overall point, I think, is well made. Now, I think you wanted to also finish by talking a little bit about
Yes.
the Marielitos in Cuba.
Right.
Or
The last thing I'll say, and this is sort of bridges domestic and foreign policy, is that in Cuba in 1980 there was an insurrection around a lot of Cubans who wanted to flee Cuba for whatever reasons they had. They're related to people who had already fled Cuba. There's a lot of politics and a lot of propaganda around Cuba and Castro and being under a socialist government. And so this like insurrection starts, and it leads to this sort of like noted episode called the Marielito boat lift, where tens of thousands of Cubans Castro opened up the gates and said, if you don't want to be here, you don't have to stay.
he kind of called their bluff. Yeah.
Yep. Hundreds of boats left South Florida in a very unsanctioned sort of way by the U.S. government, and began bringing Cubans back by the many full boats. There were boats that were not really shouldn't have made that trip, and some sank and people died and things like that. Castro also, it's noted, he also opened up the prisons and sent people who had been in prison. He sent political dissidents. He opened up the mental institutions and just kind of like let all those folks to go in. And the Carter administration, like where we've talked about, most of these episodes have been like, intentional policy to try and undermine Marxist governments, etc. Carter didn't do that as effectively against Castro, and Castro actually played the game a little better than he did. And so the Marielito boat lift, which was like one of many exoduses of Cubans fleeing the socialists in Castro, mostly because they were his political enemies, it also creates this state of disarray in Florida, but also other parts of the U.S. And it was another undermining factor, much like Iran, another undermining factor for the Carter administration in 1980.
And helped give rise to Miami Vice and Scarface.
Yep. And one thing that people don't know is they actually put many of them in like refugee camps and even like jails and detention centers throughout the U.S., particularly in the South. And they had actually put one in Arkansas, and the Cuban refugees actually staged a riot, which undermined the first term of a Arkansas governor that we know as lovingly as Bill Clinton these days. And he actually lost re-election that year because of the Marielito boat lift and the Carter policy.
Only election he ever lost.
Yeah.
It? No, he ran for Congress too and lost.
Yeah. And then Clinton, he stages a comeback, and that's where he becomes the comeback kid. But
yeah. Well, again, the point isn't to just say Jimmy Carter is a horrible, evil war criminal, although he, as president, was a horrible, evil war criminal. I mean, I think what's striking is we tend to focus on individuals, and the idea here is Carter is a decent human, as decent a human as the ruling class will ever produce, probably. So that's not how you become president. That's not how you become a governor. That's not how the Tri-Lateral Commission notices you. And I think it's, again, going back to this idea of the importance of understanding structures of the way the ruling class operates, and how, no matter what your intentions are, you kind of fit into this framework. So like today, when lefties, are bashing Biden, I mean, I'm not saying they shouldn't. My point is that Joe Biden is Joe Biden. He's been who he is for 40 years. And so, being angry at him for being Joe Biden, I'm not sure, I mean, that's who he is. Today I saw one of the lefties going off about how horrible his foreign policy is. And it's just like Trump's. And I'm like, what were you expecting? It's like when people get mad because he wouldn't say defund the police. I was like, you think he's going to come out and say burn baby burn? I mean, this is who these people are. The fact that Bernie Sanders was considered too far out there, it should tell you a lot, because Bernie Sanders is essentially a Carter Mondale, Dukakis, Gephardt liberal. There's not much difference in that other than national health care, right? And Teddy Kennedy actually had a national health care plan. So
yeah.
Carter, that's I think that's important to understand. As decent and good a human being as Jimmy Carter is and probably was, didn't matter. It didn't matter at all once you get into that system of government, that system of power, once you become part of that ruling class now. And that's why we've been talking about it so much. The ruling class can be reformist, the ruling class can be progressive. The ruling class is in a moment right now where it's understanding how badly neoliberalism, and then in the last 4 years, Trump has destabilized this system. And they are now acting as a counterbalance to that, in the Georgia voting laws and all the stuff we've been talking about for over a year that the media and the left media has suddenly discovered in the last 3 weeks. We've been talking about it for forever since we started, right? So I think it's a lesson worth knowing. And Carter, it validates the correct history, which is important. You have to know your history, but it also, I think it says a lot about just kind of the nature of American political society.
Yeah.
So,
folks, you have been listening to Bob and Scott go on about Jimmy Carter and many other things. You have been listening to the Green and Red podcast. We love talking about this stuff. We particularly love our history episodes, which is why this one's probably been almost 90 minutes. But it's an important period that, to be considered, particularly as we're going forward into the roaring 20s here. But we will be back with a new episode really soon, even after this one. We have many great episodes lined up. And so if you want to support that and you want to make sure that we continue to have great episodes, even with some of the most notable left thinkers in history or in recent history, please go to our Patreon page and become a patron at patreon.com/greenred podcast, or make a one-time donation at greenandredpodcast.org and hit that support button. And then follow us on all of our social media channels, all of the channels, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You will see this video on YouTube. And if you're watching it on YouTube, hit subscribe just to help us out. And then we have a Medium page, which we haven't actually put anything new on in a while, but I'm sure that we'll be putting up some new content before too long. And just want to thank everybody out there for listening to us and supporting us. And hope you all have a good day. Stay safe. Go raise a lot of hell. See you in the streets.